So it's that time of year again where it gets so you can barely walk through the sewing room, and sometimes some fun things happen pretty quickly this time of year. A customer at my farmer's market asked me to make 5 curling iron covers, which is actually something I've kind of resisted, but she wanted 5 of them, and she showed me what she wanted. She said she didn't need a pocket, and so I decided I would make those up and design one and make a little video at the same time. So I made 8. I have 5 back here in different fabrics, and so but I did do a binding that's pretty straight on one side. It's very similar to the way the binding on my pot holder that has a wavy edge looks. Admit it's got raw edge in one fabric across the top, and then raw edge on the side. And so I'm going to show how to make this. Here I have just 3 layers and 10 by 11 inches, my quilting fabric, my Insul-bright with the shiny side facing the ironing board cover fabric. And I'm going to quilt it. Of course, if it would be helpful to you, you should baste. Anything you wanted to quilt would be fine. I tend to like to do, for things like this, just like the backs of my oven mitts, I like to do what is sort of a modified meander, where I do a few loops, a few points, and then just kind of work around and cover the ground quickly. I'm going to stitch along the edge everywhere fairly close. I don't want to get too far in, because then when I add my bindings, those straight seams along the edge will show, and some of them may not be that attractive. So to make this work, you want to have some big enough scraps, and so 1 scrap just needs to go across the top like this, and I kind of like that. It's coral fabric. And this scrap needs to actually go around this curved end, come up here, and be able to be a loop. So this is plenty long. But so this, just like we did with the oven mitt, essentially, this needs this flattened behind. And if I have a very straight edge, I still don't line them up together. I actually put it sticking out a little further than my piece, but I stitch along here, and I'm going to use my guide, and I'm stitching along here with a seam allowance of about 3/4, or not 3/4, of about 3/8. Then taking this to my iron, I will press it like this, and then I will press it over like this. Now you could do a real elaborate thing, but I'm just going to do a very simple, and this edge wouldn't need to be straight. You could make that like the top of the oven mitt, but we're just going to do this straight. And so I'm going to iron this flat. I'll be right back. Okay, so I've pressed this nice and flat, and this will be, of course, the inside of my case. And you know, my pattern is going to be like this, and then it's going to show you how to trim this afterwards, like this, trim this in a curve. You could make it curved, but then we'd have to work kind of big, because stuff really slips around more when you have an irregular shape like that. This way it allows us to control it the best we can, of course baste if you need to, and then we'll trim it afterwards. You know, and this part probably would go to waste no matter when we did the cutting. if this were big enough that we could actually use that corner for something, and some people may want to do that. You may feel that you want to do that. The best way to do this, if you're not that good at your free motion quilting, would be to stitch a straight line and then do a little free motion. The main thing here is that we don't want this to just ravel, and so the line needs to be somewhat irregular. And so if you don't want to free motion quilt it, you could just sew in a sort of a scallop, or you could zigzag sew. I don't mean zigzag, setting it to zigzag, I mean go like this, turn, go like that, turn, and do it in lines like that, and then that would trim well. You could also cut this on the bias, and then it wouldn't fray on you. And if you stitched a line along here first, anywhere near the edge, it would tend to make it really easy to control when you free motion quilt it. I'm just gonna start doing it. Now I'm gonna just trim down this at 3/16. Okay, so now I'm gonna press this in half like this, and I'm gonna kind of blast it so that it'll stay closed for me. And I'll put this marking on the pattern. Okay, so I'm just gonna, I have been actually cutting this edge on my cutting mat, but I'm just going to trim this straight. Famous last words. So that's pretty good. And now I am going to curve this. Now I'm going to apply this binding, and I want there to be a hanging loop at the top. So I'm going to leave it sticking up above 5 or 6 inches. And as I sew this, I'm going to kind of stretch it. This piece is cut from selvage to selvage, and so it has quite a bit of stretch. And I did that on purpose because I want it to stretch. This piece here, it doesn't really matter if it's selvage to selvage, and I will note that on the instructions. It's a little bit high, not too bad, because this is just one layer of batting. But I'm gonna get all the way back to the end. So here's where I'm really going to start stretching this to get around this curve. Now, without an edge guide, you would need to probably pin this, but it's pretty easy to do with an edge guide. You can see how that wants to flip up because it was stretched so much. So here I've got my overlap that I'm going to make my little hanger out of. And here I've cut this end so that it only extends past about an inch. You can see what I'm going to create is going to look like this. And you see that? That's my little raw edge binding. So there's this little folded up end. And then when we stitch, we'll stitch it once to stitch it straight, and then we'll do a little raw edge on there. You know, this is pretty tight here. So once you get it around, it actually wants to stay there. But before we do that, we pull this out, and as if this line were extending straight, where it's folded because it's sewn, and then we pull it back across here, and then we try to get this piece, we fold it over here. And that's how we're going to have this finished on one side, finished on the end, and raw edge over here. And you may not like raw edges, and if that's the case, just do a bias fold binding or some kind of double binding that you do like, because this isn't for everybody. So this mock-up is going to show how to deal with a problem that I notice that I have about 50% of the time. What I'm seeing is that this fabric here could easily flip back and just show under my binding. And the binding is thick enough that it's not going to expose batting, but then I have to trim out that little bit that shows here. Now when that's all frayed and trimmed out, it's really not going to be noticeable, but I would prefer to avoid it. I have a little bit here too. And so when I am getting this ready to press, I'm just going to do this, and I'm going to just really push that in there so that this tends to just iron on there. And I'm not going to disturb it a lot before I press it. And then when I go to pin it, I can see here that I'm really well attached, and so I'm going to pin through there and not worry about it too much. But when I get to this part, as I go, I'll just kind of double check and just sort of flatten it through with my finger as I place in those pins, and then that way I will avoid doing more of this, which I don't know if there's a name for that. I'm calling it fold back, kind of like push back, only different. Okay, so now I'm going to pin this, and what I want to do is pin from this side. I want to bite a pretty good bite of the batting in there. And I want to just keep sure that this is looking pretty good, pretty full and tight. I don't want it to be, you know, it's not exactly the same, which I think is acceptable, but I don't want it to get really skinny and then really fat and then really skinny. I would expect that if this were more of an irregular shape, which is certainly what I do on my pot holders and the tops of the oven mitts. But for this, since I attempted to cut it straight, I'm going to attempt to have the binding look fairly straight, even though it's going to have the raw edge. And so with each pin, I'm just pulling this over to snug it up, and then I'm pinning it in there. And then I hope you can see what I'm doing. And then I'm coming to here. And then what I did when I pressed this was I just, see how this ends up where it's sewn and it folds over and then it folds under? Well, I've just pressed it to continue that. So it's just a little, like a little hem with two folds. This is ready to stitch. And I'm going to stitch it from this side with my edger foot. And so I'm going to have my needle kicked over that way, and I'm going to come down here, and I'm going to have to stop and lift this little guy up so that I can keep going, and then I'm going to stitch around, and I'm stitching on this binding. And I'm going to come down here, and when I get down here, I'm going to backstitch. So after I'm done stitching this, I will free motion quilt a little bit of a scalloped edge. Pretty small. I'll try to start with tiny little stitches or even backstitch a little at the end. And then do a little tiny scallop. It doesn't need to be perfect, it'll still be pretty cute. Then I'll trim that out. I'll make sure and trim my loop down to a point on one end. And then I'll fold that to the back side and just attach it in the back. It could be attached in the front too. It just depends on how you want it to look. I am washing mine. I want this to fray in the wash and shrink a little bit, soften up that batting a little bit, and then I'll trim any rattiness.